Hello, everyone. Morning for those who it is still morning, like me. Yes, welcome back. More Defunctland videos, aka Themeparks 102. Why is everything failing? But yeah.
In the summer of 2004, a large shipment arrived at a zoo in South Dakota called Reptile.
Of course, the immediate hydration. How dare you? Alright, alright. I got coffee.
Gardens. The package was humongous, even for the zoo that was used to receiving shipments of abnormally large animals. Reptile Gardens was expecting the package, but it was still shocking to see the contents in person. The shipment was a 16-foot crocodile named Maniac. The 34-year-old creature was born in captivity in Australia and got his name after killing other crocodiles in its habitat. For the previous 14 years, Maniac had been on display at the Australia Wildlife Park, where he witnessed the rise and fall of one of Australia's most popular theme parks.
Season 2. Wonderland Sydney. What is with this, like, 90s intro?
In 1972, Kings Island opened in Mason, Ohio. The park was the first theme park to be built by the Taft Broadcasting Company, and its new theme park division, the Kings Entertainment Company, or KECO. Taft Broadcasting would implement the theming and details seen in the theme parks constructed by the Walt Disney Company, utilizing the classic Hanna-Barbera cartoon characters that they had recently acquired. Kings Island was a huge success, and it would prompt Taft and KECO to build more parks. The company built Kings Dominion in Doswell, Virginia, which opened in 1975. They acquired Carowinds in Charlotte, North Carolina the same year. KECO would open Canada's Wonderland in Ontario, Canada in 1981. In 1985, they would be hired to operate Great America in Santa Clara, California. Taft's expansion into theme parks had been a huge success, and the company continued looking for areas to expand. The prospects of international theme parks outside of North America became much more attractive on April 5, 1983, when the Walt Disney Company opened their first international park, Tokyo Disneyland, to rave reviews and financial success. It might not be a coincidence that a mere 4 months later, Taft Broadcasting announced that they were planning to build an international theme park of their own, only their park would not be in Asia. Taft Broadcasting was going down under.
Australia, huh? Why Australia?
In 1983, Sydney, Australia was home to over 3 million people. Despite a wide array of entertainment options and a thriving art scene, the city only had one notable amusement park named the Harborside Amusement Park. The park had opened under the name Luna Park in 1935, where it had operated for over 40 years. After a tragic ride fire in 1979, the park was closed and mostly demolished, with some of its attractions being sent to the small Magic Kingdom Park just south of Sydney. Luna Park's ownership was changed, and the park, now missing most of its signature features and attractions, reopened in 1982 as Harborside Amusement Park. Local developers took notice of the controversy and instability of the park and began to consider building an all-new theme park for Sydney. As luck would have it, an American company with years of experience in the theme park industry was already looking to expand internationally. Taft Broadcasting's choice to expand its parks to Australia was far from random. Hanna-Barbera had created a studio in Sydney in 1972, and Taft would operate the Australian division of CIC Video, a VHS distributor. Due to this, the children of Australia had a familiarity and appreciation for the Hanna-Barbera characters, and after conducting a thorough market research examination on Sydney, Taft was confident that a theme park would work well in the area. The park cost an estimated $65 million to build, which was down from early projections of $75 million. Taft wanted the park to be smaller than its American counterparts, and they expected to rely on locals rather than tourists to populate the park. Some locals were concerned over Americanization of the area, especially after hearing that the park was to be the biggest in the Southern Hemisphere. The result, however, was hard to scoff at.
There's a world I'd like to live in, a world I'd like to see, where there's too much fun for everyone, and still lots left for me, where there's magic on every corner, and a smile on every
Man,
face.
ads were really different back then, I swear.
Into this perfect place. Wouldn't it be wonderful, walking hand in hand? Wouldn't it be wonderful if the world was wonderland? Wouldn't it be wonderful for every boy, girl, woman, and man? Wouldn't it be wonderful if the world was wonderland?
Man, ads really were
The
different
park,
back then.
named Australia's Wonderland, officially opened on December 7, 1985. The park's management predicted 1.6 million guests would visit the park each year, despite its limited operating schedule. The park would be open only on weekends and during school and national holidays. It would also be closed from mid-May to early August, Australians' winter months due to its location in the Southern Hemisphere. When guests first walked through the gates of Australia's Wonderland in 1985, they were greeted with 3 major lands within the park: Medieval Fair, Hanna-Barbera Land, and Gold Rush. While these lands did contain classic amusement rides, the park emphasized its live entertainment, boasting 23 different stage shows and characters unique to each land that would interact with guests. Medieval Fair was themed to the mythical Middle Ages. The land gave guests themed attractions such as a bumper car ride named the Jousting Ring, the Spinning Sea Demon, and the looping starship Bounty's Revenge. Guests experiencing the latter would often forget to empty their pockets before riding, resulting in hundreds of dollars worth of coins falling to the lake below, and in one bizarre situation, a cigarette lighter falling onto the queue's roof and exploding. Fortunately, no one was injured. Hanna-Barbera Land featured beloved characters from the cartoon studio, as well as rides and attractions based upon their respective shows. These included Judy's Jetliners, Huckleberry Hound's Merry-Go-Round, Old McScrappy's Golf Farm, Fred Flintstone's Splashdown, and the Celebrity Night Gala Show, featuring some of the more popular characters. This land also had a children's wooden roller coaster, the Beastie, which was half the size and height of Wonderland's premier attraction, the Bush Beast, located in the Gold Rush section of the park. This section included attractions such as Funnel Web, the Skyhawk, Ned Kelly's Getaway, and the river raft ride Snowy River Rampage. The Bush Beast was the main draw of the area, and it was themed as the sister to Kings Island's popular wooden coaster, the Beast. The Bush Beast reached speeds of up to 56 miles per hour and heights of 90 feet, and it was the tallest wooden roller coaster in the southern hemisphere at the time of its opening. Wonderland's opening season was a huge success, and expansions of the park were quickly greenlit to ensure public interest remained in the attraction. In 1988, Wonderland received The Beach, a water park that operated seasonally and adjacent to Wonderland, where park guests could visit without purchasing another admission ticket. In 1989, the double-lift Ferris wheel, the Zodiac, was relocated to Wonderland from Kings Island. 1990 saw the opening of yet another park adjacent to Wonderland, the Australia Wildlife Park. The park was home to over 600 animals, including dingoes, kangaroos, koalas, goannas, penguins, and crocodiles, such as the homicidal maniac. The park heavily leaned into Australian culture, most likely for the international tourists, offering activities such as boomerang throwing, whip cracking, and serving Billy tea and damper. For all of the guests wanting to experience the outback without leaving the city, this was the perfect destination. In the early 90s, Australia's Wonderland and its parks blossomed with even more shows and attractions being added. The Blinky Bill show, based off of the famous Australian cartoon, was a hit with kids, and the Rock and Roll Wrestling show featured legendary wrestlers and gave families the opportunity to win a lunch with a wrestler of their choice. Rides like the Demon, a Vekoma boomerang coaster, and the Space Probe, a drop tower, were also added to the parks, and a new themed area named Transylvania was created. Wonderland was so popular among locals that weddings were even held in the park.
Wow,
in less than
really?
a decade, Wonderland had
Imagine
proven its
that.
naysayers wrong. Those who
Having
visited
your
Wonderland
wedding
had
held in a
overwhelmingly
theme
positive
park?
experiences. Likewise, the park knew what guests wanted, and actively sought to provide fun, high-quality entertainment for the whole family. When Keko Entertainment was bought by Paramount in 1992, Wonderland was the only park out of the original 6 TAF parks to remain under local management, avoiding the era of painful intellectual property tie-ins that other parks such as Kings Island would experience. The fun seemed like it would never end, but in 1997, as Maniac watched family after family pass his cage, each enjoying their vacation in Wonderland, he nor they realized that the park's days were already numbered. In 1997, the Malaysian-based Sunway Group acquired Australia's Wonderland. Sunway Group already owned theme parks around Malaysia, and it seemed as though it was poised to take Wonderland to the next level. Despite its popularity among locals, the park's ownership was having trouble breaking even with all of the expansions and operating costs, as the park now operated year-round instead of its initial seasonal schedule. After the change in management, it was speculated that even more expansion was on the horizon for Wonderland, that perhaps Sunway Group would bring more rides, attractions, and possibly a full resort. The Sunway Group added the Skyrider attraction in 1997, changed the park's name to Wonderland Sydney to coordinate with the Olympics coming to the city in 2000, and brought properties from Marvel Comics and Cartoon Network to the park in 2002, which also brought a revamped welcome sign featuring Spider-Man and the Hulk. Popular Marvel characters now roam the parks, offering meet and greets and autographs, and a Powerpuff Girls live stage show was added. However, it soon became apparent that Sunway Group had no interest in expanding the theme park further. In fact, the company even began inexplicably shutting down whole sections of the park, using odd excuses such as efficiency studies finding that the park was too big. Select rides were closed or removed altogether. The kid favorite coaster, the Beastie, sat dormant, to the dismay of the visiting children. Compared to the rapid expansion the park saw under Keko, this was a massive blow to the locals and fans. Park goers were forced to watch their cherished local park crumble bit by bit before their eyes. In early 2004, after a slow, painful descent into disrepair, Sunway Group announced that they would be closing Wonderland Sydney. And on April 26, 2004, Wonderland Sydney closed its doors.
Oh god, no, go away. You get no ad time here.
Who? I'm a licensed dermatology provider from
Doors.
It's really up.
Yeah, the ads these days are just annoying now.
upset the Hulk, Captain America's staying brave.
Hang tough, troopers.
But no one cheers when a fun park dies.
I spent many days here, early mornings to late at night. I've got a lot of friends. Had great times.
For 18 years,
You could hear it in her voice. She is like heartbroken that the place was closing.
Wonderland Sydney has cheered up, frightened and exhilarated patrons with its Just for Fun theme. Today, park security was doing its best to keep the fun going for staff arriving for their last day on the job.
They're trying.
A lot of people have said that it's going to be like a big thing gone out of their childhood.
Sold for more than $52 million.
Everyone's doing their
will be
best.
Replaced with a business park.
Are you sad today?
For 1 year, the park sat abandoned. Rides were removed seemingly without agenda or haste. As the months went on, various attractions such as Bounty's Revenge, the Great Balloon Race, Galleon's Graveyard, Little Monsters Flying School, and the Broken Hill Mill Games Arcade were all sold and moved off of the property. By June of 2004, the Bush Beast train cars would be sitting on top of the lift hill while other trains were removed from the ride. During the same month, the park was used by the soldiers of the Reserve Response Force as training grounds. The worst part of the way in which the Sunway Group handled the park's closing was its treatment, or lack thereof, of the animals in Australia Wildlife Park. While Maniac and a few others were relocated, many of the other animals were not. Due to this, former park employees began breaking into Wonderland Sydney to rescue the animals that had been forgotten. In 2005, the demolition was halted and prolonged over an improper license dispute the demolition company was in possession of. There was an incident in 2005 where a man fell from the defunct space probe ride and sustained back injuries, although it was unclear why he was up there or what he was doing. In August of 2005, the Bush Beast was finally ripped from the ground and demolished. The Marvel superhero-themed front gate was detached and sold for $1,000 to a junkyard in Londonderry, where it still remains to this day. Even after the quick descent and abrupt closure, the question on every local and every Wonderland fan's minds was, why? Why did this beloved park, in the height of its popularity, close its doors? Sunway Group did give a reason, multiple actually. The company's CEO listed the September 11th attacks, the 2002 Bali bombings, the collapse of HIH insurance, the SARS virus, the bird flu virus, consistent losses during the Asian financial crisis, the collapse of Ansett Australia, the Iraq War, and the 2003 bushfires as the reasoning for the park's closure. However, it was obvious to everyone else that it was the Sunway Group's lack of updates and poor management that sealed Wonderland's fate. They took a lucrative offer for the land beneath the park, selling it for over $50 million, a price similar to what they bought it for, and just like that, Wonderland's fate was sealed. Since the park's closure and demolition, there have been talks and proposals for reviving Wonderland. Florida-based David Backus, who is the operations manager of Walt Disney World, promised a new park in 2021 called World of Wonder. He has stated that he is currently devoted to developing Australia's largest theme park destination resort, the spiritual successor of Wonderland Sydney, for Western Sydney Theme Park Development Trust. In addition to the theme parks, the location would include a shopping center, a sports arena, and a convention center. Classics like the Bush Beast will inspire the revamped rides, made possible by cutting-edge technology. Hopefully the new project will be able to come to fruition, and maybe even capture some of the magic that Wonderland once did. Maniac the Crocodile still entertains guests today at Reptile Gardens. Most of those that pass by his cage do not know the tragedy of Wonderland Sydney. What the Beast observed in his time at the park was a sight seen all too often. A park filled with fun and joy, a place where memories were made by millions, and a cultural landmark that made an imprint in its city. All of that killed by financial issues and corporate logistics brought about by companies barely making an attempt to manage a work of art that they don't fully understand. Even the homicidal crocodile might take issue with the death of Australia's Wonderland.
Damn, they had something good going. And for once, you can't blame Eisner. Okay, next one. Disney's scariest attraction, Cinderella Castle Mystery Tour. Doesn't sound like something that would be particularly scary. But I guess we'll see.
You've done the work and deserve.
Ads are just annoying now.
Halloween. What attraction should I do for a spooky episode this year? I know, I'll just go to a nondescript listicle site that does minimal research in a lazy but effective attempt to capitalize on nostalgia and familiarity. Well, what do you know? The top 3 scariest defunct Disney attractions. Let's see. No, already did that. Oof, did that one twice. Wait a minute. What is this? What the hell?
Below the earth, in the deepest depths of hell, is where dead and forgotten rot and dwell. But the souls beneath are not those of friends. Instead, it's theme park rides that have met their end. They go to defunct hell. All of the fun they bid farewell.
Oh, no wonder I haven't heard of this. Tokyo Disneyland. I don't think I've seen a video on Tokyo Disneyland. But then again, it's usually about... This channel's usually about failures, not successes.
Disney Universal and Cedar Fair. Now most of Six Flags is down there. They go to defunct hell.
Who did he pay to, like, make that song?
In 1971, the Walt Disney Company purchased an option to adapt author Lloyd Alexander's 5-part series, The Chronicles of Prydain, into a feature film. At the time of the purchase, Walt Disney Pictures was beginning to feel the effects of Walt Disney's death 5 years prior, and while the company had been working without their leader for some time, they had expended many of the movie concepts that he had discussed or had already set in motion. This meant that the studio would have to find new source material on their own that would align with the Walt Disney brand without the help of Walt Disney. The company's animation division, tasked with releasing a new animated feature once every 3 to 4 years, first turned to concepts that Walt had once considered. This resulted in 1973's Robin Hood and 1977's The Rescuers, but the company quickly realized that digging through Walt's trash was not a blueprint for future success. Due to a variety of pre-production issues, the Chronicles of Prydain adaptation, originally slated for a 1980 release, was pushed back to 1984, with The Fox and the Hound taking the 1980 slot. Production on The Fox and the Hound was rocky to say the least, with internal fights breaking out among producers and animators. The arguments always seemed to come back to the question of what would Walt have done, and more often than not, the winner of the argument had the idea that felt the most Disney. By the time the Chronicles of Prydain adaptation, now working with the title The Black Cauldron, entered production in 1980, the what would Walt do mindset was proving to be counterintuitive. It became clear that it was impossible to mimic a creator that was known for pushing creative boundaries. Because of this, the Black Cauldron team was allowed to take a more ambitious route for the animated film, a darker, more epic tale than most of Disney's features. It also helped that fantasy interpretations of medieval times was at peak popularity. The early 80s loved castles and knights almost as much as the late 2000s loved vampires and werewolves.
God.
The film centered around a young farmhand named Taran, a psychic pig, and a sinister villain named the Horned King. The film's storyline was often unclear, and it had drifted quite a ways from its source material. The Black Cauldron was set to release in 1984. However, that same year, a management shakeup at the Walt Disney Company resulted in Michael Eisner, Frank Wells, and Jeffrey Katzenberg joining the company. After seeing a test screening of The Black Cauldron, Katzenberg, the new head of Walt Disney Studios, was horrified at the product, claiming that it was too intense for a family audience. He demanded that the film be edited, not fully realizing that an animated film cannot be edited the same as the live-action productions he was used to working on. After the animation team explained this to him, Katzenberg became frustrated and stormed off to edit the film on his own. The film's producers called CEO Michael Eisner, who was able to convince Katzenberg to stop and calm down. The film was eventually edited, with over 10 minutes of the more graphic sections of the movie being cut. The film's release was delayed to 1985, where it debuted in July as the first Disney animated feature to receive a PG rating. The film, taking over a decade to produce, cost an estimated $44 million, making it the most expensive animated film at the time of its release. Critics praised the technical aspects of the film, but lauded its storyline and characters. It grossed just over $21 million at the box office, resulting in an over $20 million loss for the Walt Disney Company. The film's failure made the new executive team question the existence of the company's animation department, with Eisner, Wells, and Katzenberg seriously considering transitioning to a solely live-action model for Disney. The Black Cauldron was a failure and an embarrassment, and merchandising the film was certainly out of the question. Almost all of the Walt Disney Company wanted to forget its existence. Almost.
Almost.
Now, there's Tokyo Disneyland. The Japanese may not be buying our cars, but they are buying our culture. Here's American industrial robots telling the history of Japan. program not to mention World War II. So, while the band plays on, Japan's eating it all up like rice. In its first year, Tokyo Disneyland expects 10 million visitors. The mouse biz is big biz in Tokyo these days. Now, if they'd only buy our Chevrolets.
That casual racism is scarier than any jump scare I could come up with. On April 15th, 1983, 2 years before the Black Cauldron's debut, Tokyo Disneyland opened. A joint venture between the Walt Disney Company and the Japan-based developer, the Oriental Land Company, Tokyo Disneyland was immensely popular right out of the gate, with attendance figures similar and often better than the Magic Kingdom and Disneyland. This was good news for the Walt Disney Company, although many executives were disappointed that the profit from one of the company's biggest successes in the last decade had to be shared. Disney...
Yeah, they did just say that. The animatronics are programmed not to mention World War II.
The Oriental Land Company did not reinvent the wheel for Tokyo Disneyland, and the park is very similar to the Magic Kingdom in Walt Disney World. This is most obvious with the park's icon, Cinderella Castle, but the two nearly identical structures have a key difference. In the Magic Kingdom, Cinderella Castle hosts the popular restaurant, Cinderella's Royal Table. This is absent in the Tokyo Disneyland version. On opening day, there was nothing but closed doors where the entrance to Cinderella's Royal Table was supposed to be. This was because the castle was not meant to host a restaurant. It would instead house an attraction named Cinderella Castle Mystery Tour, a creepy walkthrough of the castle's dungeons complete with encounters with famous Disney villains. A manager in the Oriental Land Company described the unique setup as, Cinderella Castle is Tokyo Disneyland's symbol, and Mystery Tour is its ride. The idea for Cinderella Castle Mystery Tour came from the fact that any attraction utilizing the castle space would have to take place underground. This inspired the idea of the castle having dungeons that guests could tour. Mystery Tour takes inspiration from a Japanese ghost house. Both have labyrinth structures depicting scenes of horror, and both showcase terrifying monsters. The story that the Imagineers created had the magic mirror from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs taking on a recurring role, but this caused a slight hiccup in the attraction's production. The Imagineers felt that the magic mirror would not be recognizable if its actor's face was, quote, distinctly Japanese. However, they were also aware that the voice, language, and dialect could not be American. In order to meet these self-imposed restrictions, Imagineers had Tokyo Disneyland's entertainment division translate and record the lines for the mirror. They then took those recordings and filmed an American actor lip-syncing to them back in the United States. At the time of its opening, Tokyo Disneyland still used the A to E ticket book system. This required guests to purchase an admission ticket to get in, and additional tickets to ride the attractions in the park, typically buying them in a ticket book which held multiple ride tickets. The attractions were ranked in ticket categories from A to E, with A being for the more mundane rides and E being for the more thrilling attractions. The Castle Mystery Tour was listed as a D attraction, placing it among the ranks of the Country Bear Jamboree and the Enchanted Tiki Room. The tour was presented with the tagline, "Can you conquer the evil forces of the Disney villains in the castle?" Guests would gather outside of the attraction's entrance, located on the backside of Cinderella Castle. They would then be welcomed in groups of around 20 to 30 people, being led by a cast member, typically female, wearing a uniform similar to the huntsman from Snow White. The tour was reliant on the cast member spiel, a ride style that is rarely implemented. The Jungle Cruise and the Great Movie Ride are two of the only Disney attractions to utilize it. A spiel ride typically provides cast members with a pre-approved script. It is then their responsibility to memorize and repeat all of the information while hitting all of the beats. This is to ensure the guests receive all of the necessary exposition to understand the ride, and often more importantly, to allow the cast member to believably interact with the attraction's characters and props. Within these requirements, the cast members are generally encouraged to stick to the script while also making it their own. This personalization can take the form of timing preferences, body language and delivery, and sometimes, though mostly discouraged, script changes. The Mystery Castle tour was unique in that the cast member had to both give a spiel and navigate guests through the attraction, since there was no tracked ride vehicle to do this for them. The exact wording of the script mixed traditional Japanese courtesy with the casual speaking style that is expected from Disney's cast members. This was one of the more difficult aspects of training Japanese cast members, since their culture is very specific when it comes to communication and service roles. Guests are given a short introduction describing the tour of Cinderella Castle that they are going to receive. Those on the tour will be treated to areas such as the gallery, the ballroom, and the tower. The guide leads them into the first room, pointing out portraits of famous Disney heroes: Princess Aurora, Pinocchio, Snow White, and Taran from the Black Cauldron. Just as the guide begins to applaud the heroes and their victories against the villains, the magic mirror shows up on one of the walls, displeased that the villains are being demeaned once again. The portraits on the walls change from the heroes to their coinciding villains, as the magic mirror continues to argue with the guide. The The mirror wishes to showcase the power of the villains, and challenges the tour group to enter the mysterious dungeons of the castle, with a door on the wall swinging open on its own. The guide is surprised and urges guests to follow her through the door and down a large staircase, descending 2 stories. Guests walk past prison bars and can hear bats screeching around them. The guide comes up on a spooky laboratory, with a book open to a recipe for poison apples. Miscellaneous magical science equipment is indiscriminately scattered throughout the corner of the room. The witch's shadow can be seen as a crow rocks back and forth on a skull. The guide decides to leave before the witch shows up, taking guests down a series of dark tunnels. The witch is heard laughing as they escape. The group walks further into the dungeon, with the magic mirror appearing to be reflected down a corridor. They quickly encounter a scene of a swinging axe controlled by a knight. The scene gets even scarier when a previously still set of knight's armor begins to shake in fear. A chest along the wall is pushed open by living skeletons, and the guide screams and gives chase. During the flee, guests pass a short corridor, where a projection of the Night on Bald Mountain portion of Fantasia plays, showing Chernobog gathering his army of demons. The guide quickly directs guests away from the scene, walking a bit before stopping at what appears to be a peaceful water feature. However, Maleficent's minions appear in the water below, threatening guests to either leave or face the evils of their master. As guests rush down the hallway, the goons follow, peeking their heads through holes in the dungeon walls. Guests get a glimpse of the outside of a castle, with a lightning storm swirling around it. After this, a talking skull warns guests not to continue, but the guide pushes on. The group then enters the Cave of the Hidden Jewels, filled from top to bottom with shiny golds and diamonds. The guide is thrilled, but a lightning strike reveals that they are not alone in the room. A large dragon roars as steam escapes its jaws. The guide waves guests out of the room and into an elevator. Everyone is relieved, until the voice of a demon echoes throughout the lift, revealing that he is controlling the ride as guests ascend. The doors open and the guide timidly exits, afraid of what could come next. The group enters a room filled with tapestry displaying the story of the Black Cauldron. The guide then describes the film's plot, an integral part of the spiel considering that no one watched the film. A translation from jtcent.com outlines this part of the script. The guide says, "Once upon a time, the world was ruled by evil. The Horned King, the evil lord, used the Black Cauldron to manipulate and control the soldiers of death. Then, the courageous and pure-minded hero, Taran, deprived the power of the Great Kiln using his Sword of Light, and peace was restored to the world." The magic mirror interrupts the guide once again, taunting the guests and saying, "This is the final challenge. Will good win or evil prosper? The good will face this challenge with courage. The Black Cauldron is waiting to swallow you whole." The guide then chooses a guest, almost always a child, to carry the Sword of Light into the next room. Guests enter the room of the Black Cauldron, with skeletons lying around on the floor. The room goes dark before the fire and smoke illuminate the face of the Horned King, a large, terrifying animatronic that looms above guests. The Horned King addresses his victims by saying the most terrifying anything to ever appear in a Disney anything. He says,
"Everyone welcome. In this Black Cauldron, everything in the world is controlled. Don't be afraid. It will all be over shortly. No one can escape from here and you'll be sacrificed to the Black Cauldron. O Satan's kiln, awaken and resurrect the soldiers of death. Rebuild an army without rivals. The army of death, rise. The devil's servants, go and capture them and throw them into the cauldron. Don't leave anyone behind. The Black Cauldron wants more bodies. I swear to the death. Ha ha ha. Nobody can destroy me."
Just as all seems to be lost, a light illuminates in the group. The Chosen One and the guide are pointing the Sword of Light directly at the Horned King.
"What's that? Capture those fools and gratify the Black Cauldron."
The sword shoots beams of light, and the Horned King screams as lights flicker, smoke bellows, the music intensifies, and he is defeated. The lights dim as the guide cheers that they have won. The rest of the group follows suit, celebrating their victory. The sinister music is replaced with a triumphant symphony. As a door rises, light spills into the room, and guests exit encountering the only portion of the ride to display English, with a sign saying, "Good conquers evil." The guide directs everyone's attention to the tour's hero, placing a medal around their neck. The guide then thanks everyone for going on the adventure before directing them back outside. The mystery tour was one of the most unique and bizarre Disney attractions ever created. Extraterrestrial alien encounters.
That was interesting. Although I feel like having a proper tracked ride would also have done just fine. But I guess, I mean, It worked?
Encounter, the 1994 addition to the Magic Kingdom's Tomorrowland, which is widely considered Disney's scariest creation ever, warned guests up front of the ride's intense themes. Mystery Tour did the exact opposite, drawing guests in, promising them a tour of the beautiful Cinderella Castle, only to send them on a horrifying chase through the castle's dungeons. Mystery Tour was one of the longest attractions at Tokyo Disneyland at about 16 minutes in length. As previously stated, a single sign at the end of the attraction is the only English guests would be subjected to during the tour, unlike most rides at Tokyo Disneyland, which make an attempt to implement English throughout for international guests. The guides quickly learned to warn American and European guests not to ride the attraction because of this. The Mystery Tour officially opened on July 11, 1986. Tokyo Disneyland created some promotional material for the ride, but with the massive crowds that the park drew in, the Mystery Tour's success was almost guaranteed. In its first few months of operation, wait times of 2 to 3 hours were common. Tokyo Disneyland would further promote the Mystery Tour by creating this absolutely terrifying walk-around character. My god, who approved this? The Mystery Tour also appeared in a Tokyo Disneyland video game made for the Super Nintendo in 1994. The attraction serves as the final stage of the game, with Mickey running through the dungeons of the castle and passing by familiar scenes to those that have experienced the Mystery Tour. The Mystery Tour operated for 20 years, with little to no change or notable events. The attraction quietly closed its doors on April 5, 2006. Guests experiencing the attraction in its final days were each given one of the hero's medals, as opposed to just the chosen one that held the Sword of Light. Many have speculated the exact reason for the Mystery Tour's closure. The most widely believed theory is that the attraction was too scary for younger audiences, which seems plausible given the ride's dark theming, script, and character designs. The ride was not one of the most popular in the park, whether it be for its sinister nature or its secluded entrance. Another speculation for the closure is the attraction's limited capacity and high operating costs. While the Mystery Tour most likely couldn't cycle more than 1,000 guests per hour and did require multiple cast members performing spiels, this reason is less likely given that the attraction's maintenance costs were much lower since there was no ride system in place. Of all of the speculated reasons, the one with the most solid basis is a theory regarding the structural integrity of the ride and Cinderella Castle. The same year that the attraction closed, Japan increased its earthquake preparation regulations, with a newly required seismic structural check for buildings more than 3 stories tall. The check evaluated the structure's ability to sustain motion caused by earthquakes or tsunamis, as well as analyzed the stability of the foundation. Many believe that additional earthquake support was needed for Cinderella Castle and the attraction, and that in order to meet these new requirements, the attraction would have to be removed and reinstalled. The Oriental Land Company, possibly due to the attraction's dark themes, low capacity, and lack of popularity, decided that rebuilding it would not be worth the time and money. On April 15, 2011, just over 5 years after Mystery Tour's closure, a new castle tour entitled Cinderella's Fairy Tale Hall opened. The attraction is a lot different than its predecessor. It is essentially a walkthrough exhibit, with mini figurines, artwork, and photo opportunities. Disappointingly, there is no continuous story to Fairy Tale Hall. It's almost the exact tour that was promised to guests at the beginning of Mystery Tour before things went awry. While it is unfortunate that such a bold and unique attraction was replaced with a much safer alternative, the addition of Cinderella's Fairy Tale Hall makes perfect sense, and it arguably fits the theming and tone of Cinderella Castle better than Mystery Tour did. Cinderella Castle Mystery Tour was one of the most unique Disney attractions of all time. It is the only Disney attraction to prominently feature characters from the Black Cauldron, and it is one of, if not the darkest Disney attraction ever created. Its unique style has inspired the creation of other attractions of its kind. For one, Disneyland Paris' Sleeping Beauty Castle houses a walkthrough attraction called the Dragon's Lair, which allows guests to go underneath the castle and encounter a massive dragon animatronic. Most notably, a new castle walkthrough attraction that opened with Shanghai Disneyland in 2016. The attraction uses similar elements to the Mystery Tour, with more tame theming and scenes. Many fans are disappointed that the Mystery Tour was removed, but a larger amount of theme park and Disney fans are unaware that it ever existed. With so much focus going to the US parks, it is surprising to many that the most unique attractions are actually those that exist overseas. The Japanese market and the Oriental Land Company pushes the Imagineers to step outside of their comfort zone, and it is in that environment that a new level of art can be produced. The more ambitious the storytelling, the more strong the audience's reaction to it, whether it be negative, positive, or just plain confusing.
Top 10 forgotten Disneyland attractions. Alright, let's go for it. Add.
Fans, it's Disney Dan here, but wait a minute, why am I on the Defunctland YouTube?
Dan, let's skip the dumb intro skit and just get this thing going.
Sounds good. Another top 5 video?
Make it top 10. We're going for the big bucks. Speaking of big bucks, did you know that you could win money by playing trivia with the free Swag IQ app? Games are at 8 p.m. Eastern, Sunday through Thursday.
Whoa, Kevin, are you alright? You're talking kind of weird. Wait, did we get sponsored by the wonderful people at Swag IQ, where anyone that answers the game's 10 trivia questions correctly gets to split a daily jackpot?
Bring the chip home, galactic, and I'm looking to get more. Raise it up, seeing what you don't know. Running like the blood, pumping from the pressure of adrenaline rush. We crush whatever we touch. Where you been, yo?
Opening on July 17th, 1955, Disneyland Park in Anaheim, California has operated for over 60 years. It might have the richest and most complex history of any theme park in the world. Along with this comes a variety of attractions, shops, and experiences that have gone by the wayside. Today we are going to be talking about 10 in particular. These are the top 10 extinct opening day Disneyland attractions.
Davy Crockett Land.
Frontierland needed a mascot and a big attraction to pull in crowds and give them something entertaining, and no one man better suited that legendary position than Davy Crockett himself. The dusty, barren corner of the park featured a large wooden fort that held a very popular Davy Crockett arcade, a shooting gallery full of fun gags and interesting lore. The neighboring Davy Crockett Museum featured a few showcases, including an Alamo exhibit with 2 life-size wax figures of Fess Parker and Buddy Ebsen, a historical firearms display sponsored by the NRA, and a recreation of a frontier...
A historical firearms display sponsored by the NRA. Really? In Disneyland?
mercantile that served as a themed gift shop. The building would also serve for the occasional Davy Crockett character meet and greet, where guests could get photos and interact with the legendary hero. The museum portion of the attraction wasn't too popular and quickly closed, with the wax figures moving out to Tom Sawyer's Island. As Frontierland continued to grow and technology improved, a new shooting gallery, the Frontierland Shooting Exposition, opened in the 80s, leading to the original arcade to eventually close and reopen as another gift shop experience. The original Davy Crockett arcade helped pave the way for many Disney parks to feature some sort of fancy shooting gallery, and while not much remains of the original Davy Crockett experience, the foundation and spirit of Frontierland that he created still lives on today.
In the 1950s, television was dominated by shows depicting the Wild West, namely, conflicts between cowboys and Native Americans. This staple of pop culture found its way into Frontierland on opening day in the form of the Indian Village. Located right next to Aunt Jemima's Pancake House, the small village exhibit featured the ceremonial dance circle and a full-blooded native chief. In a surprisingly progressive performance system, Disney would contract various tribes for 6-month stints at the park to demonstrate their culture to the guests, before rotating them out for a new tribe to share their unique traditions. However, this Indian village wouldn't last too long, as it would be quickly moved to the Rivers of America in 1956, where it would be greatly expanded in comparison to the opening day version.
The Disneyland that you know today is not the Disneyland that the public knew in 1955. While every corner of the park is now packed with an attraction and no space is necessarily wasted, 60 years ago the layout of the land was sparse and empty. Over in Frontierland, families could fish, picnic, and just relax in the wide open prairie pastures, a stark contrast to the fast-paced thrill ride that now sits in its place. And for Frontierland's signature attraction, was it an animatronic musical review? Was it a runaway mine train? No. It was mules. Just mules. Groups of 10 would hop on their own mule and be led through the tall rock formations and desert-like conditions of Frontierland. This live animal attraction, called the Mule Pack, lasted in the park for nearly 20 years, occasionally getting a facelift as the Frontierland area expanded. When the park built the mining village of Rainbow Ridge, the mule ride changed its name to the Rainbow Ridge Pack Mules. And then again, after Nature's Wonderland mine train opened, the attraction was renamed Pack Mules Through Nature's Wonderland. Some incredibly original and creative naming by the parks team. By the end, you would pass through a small village, sections of rock formations filled with animatronic animals, and slowly trace the trails of an old mine train. With close to 75 working mules in the parks at any given time, the maintenance of live animals was burdensome and unpredictable. The mules would often refuse to move, which didn't make for much of a ride, and if the cast member forced them to move, the situation got even worse. Also, mules would often decide to follow their own heart rather than the pre-approved path. When Disneyland announced their new e-ticket roller coaster Big Thunder Mountain in the 70s, most of Frontierland, including the pack mules, were packed up and shipped off into the desert. The pack mule attraction was one of a kind for Disneyland, with no other park featuring anything remotely similar.
Disney's signature Circle Vision 360 films have been featured in multiple Disney parks throughout the world, and the first film debuted in Disneyland's Tomorrowland on opening day. Presented as Circarama USA, the first film to debut was named A Tour of the West. Sponsored by American Motors, the 12-minute film utilized groundbreaking technology designed by Disney legends. The concept apparently came from a conversation between UB Iwerks and Walt Disney, in which Iwerks was explaining issues that the crew of the film Westward Ho! The Wagons was facing when trying to adapt the newly introduced CinemaScope process. This is when Disney asked Iwerks if there was a way to make a film that extended the screen even more, perhaps 360 degrees around the entire audience. What Iwerks and his team were able to produce was more impressive than any previous attempts at cinematic immersion. The resulting exhibit in Tomorrowland, as with other earlier Disneyland attractions, had varying names. These included American Motors Circarama Exhibit, American Motors Exhibit, American Motors Presents Circarama, and just Circarama. In the sign directly outside the show building, the Circarama logo was presented in black letters, except the letters CAR, which were colored red, just in case you didn't realize that the exhibit was sponsored by American Motors. To further drive home the sponsorship...
I see what you did there.
Dan, it's my turn?
Yeah, sorry.
To further emphasize the sponsorship, American Motors placed 5 cars on the floor of the theater. The appliance company Kelvinator, which had recently been absorbed into the American Motors Corporation, also had a variety of kitchen and home appliances placed around the show building. The film itself was shot using 11 cameras placed in a circle on a specially made rig. How did that rig get around? Well, it was placed on top of none other than the American Motors Rambler, both a sports fastback and roomy enough for the family too. And you thought our sponsorship was shameless. By the way, big thanks to Swag IQ for sponsoring this video. The Tour of the West film comprised of exterior shots of landmarks such as Monument Valley, the Grand Canyon, Las Vegas, and the streets of Los Angeles. The film was projected above the audience by 11 projectors with small black strips in between each screen. This was done in order to avoid the blind spots created by the camera rig. Tour of the West lasted until 1960, where it was replaced by a new Circle Vision film, America the Beautiful.
Rocket to the moon.
Do you enjoy snacking at the Tomorrowland Pizza Port? Or is it now Pizza Planet? Regardless, of course you don't, because the pizza there is awful. It's practically made out of cardboard, and tastes like it's been rehydrated from some weird NASA-approved astronaut freeze-dried packet. Long before the Pizza Port was dishing out gross quick-serve pizza, the space was occupied by the opening day attraction Rocket to the Moon, a centerpiece of the Disneyland Spaceport in Tomorrowland. The Rocket to the Moon attraction took guests on a simulated space trip to the moon and back using nothing more than 2 large screens and circular stadium ride seating. Outside the attraction, a massive 80-foot tall rocket ship greeted you, the tallest structure in the park at the time, 3 feet taller than the castle. It was placed outside the attraction to give guests a reference for the ship that they were about to board.
I'd like to give you some idea about the rocket ship itself and explain some of the more interesting highlights of our operation here. So when the flight gets underway, you'll be able to see by watching the upper screen what's ahead of you, and by watching the lower screen you can see what you've left behind.
Upon entering the futuristic-looking space station, you were directed to one of 2 rockets, Luna or Diane, changed a few years later to Arcturus and Polaris. In this short queue area, there were special weighing stations that actually told guests what their weight would be once they landed on the moon. After being directed to their rocket, guests would enter and sit into a large round room. The room featured a screen above their heads to show where the rocket was going, and a central screen on the floor to show a bird's eye view of where the rocket was taking off from. The floor would begin to rumble as the rocket took off thanks to large speakers hidden under the floor. Then guests could peer down at the central screen, showing an ever-increasingly distant Anaheim below the ship, as the screen up above them showed the moon growing closer and closer. Eventually, the guests would reach the moon, slowly passing around its orbit while learning facts from the movie's voiceover before flying back down to the surface and landing like one of Elon Musk's new fancy rocket pods. This was seriously ahead of its time. Over the many years and many facelifts of Tomorrowland, the ride would get rethemed, eventually ending on Mission to Mars, until of course the major renovation to Tomorrowland in 1998, when the ride was gutted and the show building was transformed into a pizza joint. A new rocket, about 30% smaller, was built outside to promote Coca-Cola products, and the only remnant of the ride today is the high-peaked front facade painted over after the Douglas Aircraft Company dropped their sponsorship.
One of the most recognizable features of Disneyland's Tomorrowland is the lagoon that currently hosts Finding Nemo's submarine voyage. But this was of course not present on opening day. It would not be until 1959 that the original submarine voyage would open in Tomorrowland. So what was in that spot when the park opened? A lagoon. A much less impressive lagoon.
Well, we ought to go down to the boat landing. Ronnie Reagan, are you there? Take it away.
Thank you very much, Art. And here on the Lake of Tomorrowland, we have boats made out of fiberglass, and they're as strong and safe as anything afloat.
An attraction named the Tomorrowland Boats allowed guests to drive small boats in laps around the small pond. You heard that right. Guests were given the wheel. Surprisingly, this turned out to be a bad idea. The small motors of the boat would overheat when guests attempted to speed up, and a towboat had to come around and pick up the stranded vessels. On top of this, the smoke released by the motors was dense and problematic. Disneyland's management came up with the brilliant solution to enclose the motor within the boat. In another shocking twist, while this did reduce smoke, it only made the overheating problem worse. Another attempted solution was to add a cast member to each boat, which drastically increased the operating cost of the attraction. The attraction was eventually renamed to the Phantom Boats, but the issues proved to be too much for the small lagoon, and it would close in August of 1956. It was the first attraction to close, and
Oh, come on. You get no ad time.
shortest-lived Disneyland attraction.
Space Station X1.
It's almost hard to remember that before Omni-Movers and massive rotating theaters, attractions were sometimes nothing more than a large, moving floor that passed by windows displaying gorgeously detailed paintings. This was the case for Space Station X1, a futuristic experience that took guests high into orbit to a remote space station that overlooked vast, distant, picturesque views of the Earth below. Upon boarding the large circular yellow space station, you would begin your journey on the east coast as a sunrise crested over the horizon, and by the end of your journey, you would witness a lovely sunset on the west coast. The show building was a large circular room with a massive painted portrait of the Earth that wrapped around the exterior. The mural was textured and 3D, giving the illusion of a live topographical view of the Earth from orbit. The black space above the painting was lined with pinhole lights to simulate distant stars, while clouds and storms were projected onto the surface.
Close by, one of our studio artists was painting a miniature model of what was to be our cyclorama. When completed in full scale, it will be seen in Tomorrowland, and will give the illusion of a panoramic view of America as seen from a space station, traveling in an orbit 500 miles above the Earth.
You would travel around the room in front of your small 3-foot by 4-foot window, peering out over the painting that showed off small cities, rolling mountains, and even a deep forest with a fire that billowed smoke. Eventually, the ride was updated and renamed Satellite View of America after the first real US satellite provided aerial views of the world in 1958. But low attendance and disinterest in space led to the attraction closing in early 1960, replaced by the Art of Animation exhibit.
Visiting present-day Disneyland can be a fantastic experience. The rides, shows, and various entertainment options provide fun for all ages. But there's one thing missing in the happiest place on Earth. That is, of course, a science museum. While this is absent from Disneyland's current attraction lineup, on opening day, such an experience did exist. The Monsanto Hall of Chemistry was a free walkthrough museum, focusing on the wonders of chemicals and plastics. The outside of the building featured an illustration of an atom, with fountains and lights dancing along the wall. The inside was an exhibit promoting Monsanto's creation of various products. The signature exhibit in the Hall of Chemistry was the Chematron, 8 tubes each containing a different basic natural element that was used by Monsanto to create over 500 chemicals. The idea of this aged about as well as an exhibit called The Magic of Lobotomies would have, but it lasted a surprising 11 years, eventually closing in September 1966 due to declining interest from the public and to better utilize the large building in Tomorrowland. In 1967, the space would be transformed into another Monsanto-sponsored attraction, Adventures Through Inner Space, which would eventually be replaced by the building's current tenant, Star Tours.
Hall of Fame?
The Tomorrowland area of Disneyland was one of the most heavily sponsored parts of the park, with tons of companies trying to put a face and brand on the future. And while most rides were sponsored by big corporations, some took it a step further by actually installing exhibits of their futuristic products in the park, which is what brings us to the Kaiser Aluminum Hall of Fame. The bright, shiny, lightweight material was the metal of the future in 1955, and the Aluminum Hall of Fame was there to dazzle guests with all its splendid wonders. The self-guided walkthrough tour attraction featured dozens of wild creations all out of aluminum. First, guests were greeted by the Kaiser Aluminum Pig, the mascot for the attraction, alongside a massive aluminum telescope structure. Next, guests would see more practical uses of aluminum with appliances, building materials, and various showcases. You eventually ended up in the final large hall that housed the future of aluminum. The two big highlights of the final hall were the Time Sphere, a massive, highly polished aluminum sphere that displayed medieval knights, firemen, and astronauts, all wearing aluminum in one form or another. And the brightest star in the world of metals, a large metallic glowing star.
And now we'll take you into the future again and the aluminum exhibit and show you the aluminum telescope. Bob Cummings, take it away.
This is Dr. Heinz Haber, and I'm sure you will remember him from Walt Disney's Tomorrowland. Mr. Haber has a very interesting experiment to show us here as we stand in front of this giant aluminum telescope, which was built especially for the Disneyland show.
Soon after the park opened, Kaiser felt that Disney was spreading himself too thin and introducing too many possible competitors to the Kaiser brand. They immediately wanted out, but Walt convinced them to stick around for a few years longer. But eventually, the company and their lavish display packed up and left the theme park the moment their 5-year contract expired. Today, the building that once housed the shiny metal now houses a robot made of shiny metal, as it was absorbed into the show building needed for Star Tours.
Disney, being such a family-oriented brand, rarely tries to appeal to a strictly older audience. Rarely. That said, when Disneyland first opened, Main Street USA featured a small little shop with the sign, Intimate Apparel, Brasiers, Torsalettes.
Oh yeah.
Walk inside and it is in fact a lingerie shop, presented by Hollywood Maxwell Brasier Company of Los Angeles.
City of Angels, baby.
Inside you will meet the wonderful Wizard of Bras, speaking from a smooth 8-track and turning round and round on a rotating stage. The wizard takes you through the history of the Land Down Undies. See the unmentionables of recent history in 3D illusion boxes, and watch those undies appear, or
you get the idea.
Kevin, you're having a little too much fun with this. We should probably wrap it up.
Fine, that's basically it. It was a lingerie store right next to Grandma's Baby Shop, which Intimate Apparel, Brasiers, Torsalettes actually outlived. The Wizard of Bras and the store only lasted until January of 1956, before it was absorbed by the neighboring Glass and China shop. Special thanks to Disney Dan for helping out with this video. Go check out his YouTube channel with the link in the description, and don't forget to download Swag IQ with the link below. Thanks for watching,
and we'll see you next time on Defunctland.
Oh man, you've got some issues.
Still though, that's the last thing I was expecting. Like a lingerie shop at Disneyland, especially when it first opened. Wow. Oh man, Disney has a wild history. Nara Dreamland. Alright, I want to see this one. Excuse me.
Magic Cauldron, it's time to...
Hey, I know this is about Disney, but you don't get ad time here at Disney.
から仲良くなって奈良にゴルフ場を作るっていう計画を聞いてうちのママに紹介したんや。 内藤から立石に応答願います。おい、こちら立石だ、どうぞ。黒田の女が現れました。尾行します、どうぞ。よし、すぐ。
This is supposed to be a movie? Did he actually try and put his name into, like, kanji?
On July 17, 1955, Disneyland Park in Anaheim, California opened its gates. The park was a near-instant success and changed themed entertainment forever. Walt Disney had been told that his concepts for an elaborately themed entertainment park were unprofitable and that he was out of his element. Of course, Disneyland would be the biggest thing to ever happen to the theme park industry, and Disney theme parks are now the most popular theme parks in the world. Not long after the opening of Disneyland, Kunizo Matsuo, the president of the Japanese Matsuo Entertainment Company, flew to California to see the park for himself. He was more than impressed, and strongly believed a park like Disneyland would work perfectly in Japan. Matsuo became a mediator for the Japanese Dream Sightseeing Company, and got in direct contact with Walt Disney himself. Though Tokyo might have seemed the best location for a Disney park, Matsuo had a background as a kabuki actor, and was deeply invested in the history and culture of Japan, hence the proposed location of the country's former capital, Nara. Walt took to the idea of an international park, and agreed on building it in the city of Nara. Construction began on Nara Disneyland with the guidance of Walt and his creative team. The park was heavily influenced by Disneyland in Anaheim. It was designed in the same spoken wheel pattern and featured a replica of Sleeping Beauty Castle. Also in the hub was a great fountain and a small stage used for character shows and events. Nara Disneyland would feature a Main Street, a Fantasyland, a Tomorrowland, an Adventureland, and a unique Ancestorland in place of Frontierland. Park admission was to be free, and guests could experience attractions by purchasing tickets at ticket booths scattered throughout the park. Near the end of construction, Matsuo and Disney began to argue over licensing fees. An agreement needed to be reached for Matsuo to feature Disney properties in the park. The two were unable to compromise, and Disney pulled his support, meaning that Nara Disneyland had to be scrapped. However, the park was already near completion. Because of this, Matsuo quickly rebranded the park to Nara Dreamland, and new mascots were created in the form of Ranchan and Dory-chan, two children dressed as British Royal Guards. While the end result was incredibly similar to Disneyland, there were still very few parks of its type in the world, and its design was especially unique to Japan, whose leisure industry was just beginning to recover after the devastation the country faced in and after World War II. The Happiest Place in Japan opened on July 1, 1961, and while those familiar with Anaheim's park might have seen a shoddy knockoff, the visitors saw a world of fantasy.
奈良は今歴史的な文化財とは別に新しい観光資源を開発し、規模の大きい観光地に飛躍しようとしています。子供たちを対象にしたデラックス遊園地、アメリカのディズニーランドをモデルにしたと言われるだけに万事が大規模で日本離れしています。それだけにアメリカインディアンと古都奈良の佇まいが対照的でありすぎることも事実のようです。
At the park entrance, guests were greeted by Nara Dreamland's train station, which served as the sole stop for the Nara Dreamland Railroad. This narrow-gauge railroad took guests on a grand circle tour of the park, and journeyed through a tunnel that showcased a Wild West diorama. Upon entering the park, guests could then choose one of the 4 tunnels to take them to Main Street. This area included vehicles such as an omnibus, a fire engine, and horse-drawn carriages. The street included a town hall, a fire station, an opera house, a church, and a handful of shops and eateries. The focal point was the castle, which also functioned as the primary entrance to Fantasyland. Fantasyland included a classic carousel, a teacup ride, multiple boat attractions on a small lake, a haunted maze, and a skyway. Upon first glance, it might seem as though both the lake boats and the haunted maze were not Disney knockoffs. But this is only half true. When Disneyland first opened, it featured both the Phantom boats and the motorboat cruise, attractions similar to and probably the inspiration for Nara's boats. One of the boating attractions was Turtle Boat, a ride which took guests on small turtle-shaped boats that led them into Ryugu Palace to meet Princess Otohime and a group of mermaids. This was one of the many Nara Dreamland attractions to have its roots in Japanese history and folklore. Its design also drew inspiration from Disneyland's Storybook Land canal boats. The Haunted Maze predated Disneyland's Haunted Mansion by 8 years, although the classic Disney ride had been in development before Dreamland opened. The Haunted Maze's facade was shaped like a witch, a grotesque image, especially for the fantasy section of the park. The opening year brochure describes the attraction with the line, "Satan and many goblins await you." Guests were given a card upon entry to the maze and were challenged to find 3 checkpoints within the building to get the card stamped. The maze was very dark and had scattered theming, primarily skeletons behind metal bars. Fantasyland also featured an attraction called the Miracle House, a ride in which guests would enter a show building, board a small pirate ship, and fly over various scenes from around the world. This was clearly supposed to be Nara Disneyland's Peter Pan attraction before the licensing rights fell through. The Miracle House attraction would open with guests flying over the United States, Egypt, and the South Seas Islands. Fantasyland also had a variety of attractions added after the park's opening. These included a handful of kiddie attractions and carnival rides such as Flashdance, Pirate Swings, and Pirate Octopus. An update of the opening day teacup ride featured extra theming, more elaborate paint on the cups, and a canopy that covered the ride area. Fantasyland also saw the addition of 3 coasters over the years. In 1979, the famous Screw Coaster opened to the delight of park guests. This was the popular corkscrew model designed by Aerodynamics, with similar iterations found at parks such as Busch Gardens Tampa and Alton Towers. The Kids Coaster and Fantasy Coaster, both milder family rides, would later open on the northwest side of Fantasyland. Tomorrowland opened with a familiar popular attraction, Bobsleigh, a tubular steel coaster modeled after Disneyland's Matterhorn bobsleds. The mountain didn't just house the coaster, it also served as a midway point for Nara Dreamland's Skyway attraction that ran from Fantasyland to Tomorrowland, similar to Disneyland's setup at the time. In addition to Freeway, an Autopia-inspired attraction, Tomorrowland also had smaller family-friendly rides such as Astrojets, Loop-the-Loop, and a truly remarkable hovercrafts attraction, where guests could steer hovercrafts around a small lake near the bobsleigh. The land also opened with an attraction familiar to Disneyland fans, the Flying Saucers. This attraction sat guests in round seats on top of an oversized air hockey table. Guests could lean side to side to maneuver their seats over the air holes, with the goal being to bump the other guests. Some attractions added later on didn't quite fit the theming, such as Aero Development's Antique Car Ride attraction. Though Aero made many iterations of this classic ride, Nara stood out, as the ride vehicles were actually a combination of 2 different car models, the top portion of the Ford Touring Car and the bottom portion of the Aero Cadillac, which may have been done to cut costs. The Antique Car Ride sat on the filled plot of the Submarine Voyage, a ride in which guests boarded a wooden coaster manufactured by Intamin and inspired by the classic Coney Island Cyclone coaster, opened on the border of Tomorrowland and Main Street. For a park that was starting to slump financially, Oscar was a great addition to the park. Riders were surprised at just how good the coaster was, some claiming Nara Dreamland didn't deserve it. Adventureland sported a familiar wooden archway over its entrance and seemingly only ever housed one attraction, Jungle Cruise. This followed the same idea and plot as the Jungle Cruise at Disneyland. Guests embark on a cruise through the jungle to admire the local flora and fauna, only to end in a confrontation with a native tribe. Guests encountered a variety of animals, the skipper used a gun to scare away predators, and guests could delight in the backside of water. Ancestorland was Nara Dreamland's version of Frontierland, and it celebrated the history and culture of Japan. The land consisted of replicas of historical Japanese structures and was bordered by a river. Guests could take a variety of boat types along the river to navigate the land, as well as view miniature replicas of Japanese sites. The land ultimately served as a way for guests to take a trip through the rich history of Japan, and everything from samurai residencies, to markets, to brothels were represented in the area. Ancestorland ultimately met a sad fate, as it was demolished to make way for a water park area. Small remains such as shrines were left behind, though unkempt. The water park area that replaced it was pretty standard, and featured a variety of slides and pools. At its peak, Nara Dreamland brought in 1.63 million visitors a year. This led to its sister park, Yokohama Dreamland, to open in 1964. This park focused less on rides and more on entertainment and landscaping to entice guests. Despite that, Yokohama did sport a handful of attractions, which could also be ridden in exchange for tickets bought throughout the park. An opening day monorail, the Dream Development Dreamland Line, was unique in that it made a stop at the railway station outside of the park itself. It was short-lived though, as cracks began forming in its support beams and repairs could not be made. After a year and 4 months of operation, all service of the line was suspended, and ultimately never returned. The park also featured 3 roller coasters, a Ferris wheel, a children's train ride, and a submarine voyage. Both parks were well loved, and their popularity proved that Japan was ripe for major theme parks. Unfortunately for Dreamland, this would also be its downfall.
At PetSmart Kitchen, we're sharing helpful hacks to make your dog's mealtime.
Back off. Those were some trippy looking ads.
I'm in Anaheim.
Never mind the fact that it's actually 10 o'clock, but I won't get picky.
In 1983, a true Disneyland would finally open in Japan. Tokyo Disneyland came with immersive theming and creative properties that blew Nara out of the water. The knockoff was hit hard by Disneyland's opening, and attendance sank to 1 million guests a year. The park quickly suffered from lower budgets and poor upkeep, and by the mid-90s, the park was littered with trash, rides were standing but not operating, and stray animals could be found roaming the property. In 2001, both Tokyo Disney Sea and Universal Studios Japan opened. This was the final nail in the coffin for Nara Dreamland. Attendance slumped to a depressing 400,000 visitors a year. By 2004, the shops on Main Street were quickly closing. Building facades were noticeably rotting and beginning to lean from foundational issues. Rust gathered on the coasters, and small rides shut down but remained standing. Some attractions, such as the log flume in Tomorrowland, would operate despite no riders. Yokohama Dreamland was facing the same set of problems, and the park closed on February 17, 2002 due to the financial issues. The park sat abandoned for 3 years before the rides were dismantled and the remaining buildings were repurposed for the Yokohama School of Pharmacy. Nara Dreamland continued operation until August 31, 2006. The park's closing was made known, but few guests showed up to experience the final day of operation. Midway through the day, it began to rain, and most visitors headed home early. The park closed its gates and was left abandoned. Nara Dreamland was frozen in time, if anything, gaining visitors looking to explore the remains. The park gained a huge following online, with people taking pictures and videos of the creepy, abandoned Disney knockoff. On top of urban explorers, vandals also frequented the park. Aside from the expected graffiti, many of them moved the park's props around in order to depict sinister scenes. No initial effort was made to preserve what remained of Nara Dreamland, and unlike most amusement parks that close, no attractions were sold to other theme parks in the region. The Nara Dreamland property was put up for sale in 2011 with no bids. The property was foreclosed in 2014, and finally sold to SK Housing in 2015. Renovation remained stagnant for a while, supposedly due to the demolition being too expensive for SK Housing. After a year, demolition finally began, and the entire park was gone by December 21, 2017. All rides were scrapped and the ground was leveled to make way for senior housing. Nara Dreamland is most known for its abandoned state between 2006 and 2016, and is often believed to be the most elaborate Disney knockoff of all time. But it was so much more. The park began as the next Disneyland, with guidance from Walt Disney himself. It opened with immersive theming and rave reviews, and it paved the way for theme park companies to realize how profitable expanding overseas could be. While Nara Dreamland couldn't keep up with the giants in the entertainment industry, it should be remembered for its valiant attempt to bring magic and fantasy to a new part of the world.
何よりもみんなの笑顔が最高の思い出だよね。本当に45年間ララドリームランドを好きでいてくれて皆さん本当にありがとうございました。
Nara Dreamland walked so Tokyo Disneyland could run. Oof, what else? Ah, this channel just has so much. I don't know where to go next. Oh god, Action Park. We already saw that one. Hang on, there was one video up here. I wanted to take a look at. Adventure through inner space.
Today, not tomorrow, not next week. Today.
Thank you, Vice President Kamala Harris. Adventure through inner space. The theme of this ride supposed to be?
WED Enterprises, Glendale, California, Walt Disney's amusement park design firm, a creative playground for artists and engineers. All that came were directed, instructed, and mentored by Walt Disney himself, who considered the Imagineers to be his top artists. These included Herb Ryman, concept artist, Xavier Atencio, show writer, Yale Gracie, special effects, Claude Coates, show designer, Bob Gurr, ride designer, John Hench, designer and futurist, and the most recent recruit, George McGinnis, designer. While reviews of Walt within his animation studio were mixed, the Imagineers loved working for Uncle Walt. They knew to give each project their all. Walt instilled in them his philosophy.
Hello there, Elevator 45. Thank you for the follow. Welcome to the stream. I hope you're enjoying the wild history of amusement parks. And, I guess it would seem that the elevators 1 through 44 were already taken. But yeah, hope you're doing well. Thank you for stopping by and enjoy the history of Disneyland's Adventure Through Inner Space. Can't say I've heard of this ride, though, before. Mind you, it's been a while since I've been to Disneyland.
Philosophies of entertainment and storytelling. Walt did not want to.
Hello, Michael. Welcome back. Thankfully, no one needs to be banned today. Or so far, at least.
Create rides. He wanted to create experiences, stories that could be lived. Under Walt's eye, the Imagineers became a family, creating groundbreaking attractions and developing friendships among each other. But this group, in 1966, was just at the beginning of their journey. Their true test was on its way.
Ah, hydrate. Fine. You and your hydration.
In January of 1965, executives from the Monsanto Chemical Company traveled to Anaheim, California to visit Disneyland Park. Among them was Monsanto's chairman, Dr. Charles Allen Thomas. The 64-year-old chemist had been working with Monsanto since 1936, and his claim to fame was his work on plutonium research for the Manhattan Project, which he conducted alongside Monsanto's Central Research Department. Thomas and his associates were traveling to Disneyland to view Monsanto's 3 exhibits in the park's Tomorrowland area: the Monsanto Hall of Chemistry, the Monsanto House of the Future, and the newest edition, Fashion and Fabrics Throughout the Ages. All 3 had been overseen by Thomas, who had worked closely with Walt since Disneyland's opening, resulting in a friendship between the two men. Thomas and the Monsanto team were fresh off of a trip to the 1964 World's Fair, at which they had seen the latest in attraction technology and speculative futures. With the fair fresh in their minds, Monsanto's Tomorrowland exhibits were looking more antiquated than ever. Thomas and his associates were not alone in their opinion. Walt Disney and his Imagineers had participated in the 1964 fair, creating 4 popular and groundbreaking attractions. After the fair, Walt turned his attention to the company's Florida project and his proposed City of Tomorrow, Epcot. But he also greenlit several other projects for his amusement design firm to complete, including a pirate-themed boat ride and a haunted house attraction. The largest of these post-fair projects was a complete refresh of Disneyland's Tomorrowland area. Outside of its 1959 expansion and a few other minor changes, the area had not evolved since its opening in 1955. Walt had never been satisfied with Tomorrowland. The rushed area was overly reliant on corporate sponsors, and some attractions had become noticeably outdated, while others were never futuristic to begin with. The Tomorrowland renovation would usher in a wave of new attractions that would engage in actual speculation of the future, with an emphasis of the transportation of tomorrow. Possibly Walt's greatest fascination, the entire new Tomorrowland project would be given the unique theme, World on the Move.
New ideas for Disneyland are first visualized in artists' renderings like this overall view of the new Tomorrowland area. The painting begins to take on form and dimension with construction of a scale model, detailing every attraction. This scale model represents more than 5 acres of new attractions in Tomorrowland.
The main avenue of Tomorrowland would be completely overhauled, with almost no inch untouched. The area's signature attraction, Rocket to the Moon, would be demolished and rebuilt with larger theaters. It would also be given a pre-show starring an animatronic named Mr. Tom Morrow. The attraction would be renamed to Flight to the Moon and was set in a future in which, quote, travel to outer space will be an everyday adventure. The Circarama 360 film America the Beautiful would be replaced by the CircleVision 360 film America the Beautiful. The new film of the same name was shot with a new method, using 9 cameras as opposed to the original 11. The theater itself would also be expanded, taking up more of Tomorrowland's North exhibit building, closing the Art of Animation exhibit permanently. The rest of the show building, where the Art Corner exhibit once was, would be replaced by the Tomorrowland Terrace restaurant. The addition of the Tomorrowland Terrace would also result in the closure of the Yacht Bar. The Astrojet spinner would be replaced by the Rocket Jets, which would be elevated to rest on top of the loading platform for a brand new Tomorrowland attraction, the People Mover. The People Mover was a ride that gave guests a tour around Tomorrowland and through its attractions, with onboard audio describing the various sites. The People Mover was an evolution of the technology first used for the Ford Magic Skyway attraction at the 1964 New York World's Fair, and the ride was meant to act as a prototype to the transit system that would be integral to Walt's experimental community project. The People Mover would also travel to the front of the land, passing above guests' heads, in the area that the Clock of the World once was. Another attraction from the 1964 fair, the Carousel of Progress, would be relocated to Tomorrowland, taking the place previously held by the Space Bar restaurant. The new show building would have 2 stories, with the Carousel show taking up the first floor and the second floor giving guests a view of Walt's experimental community concept in model form. The often unreliable Flying Saucers attraction would also be removed and replaced with a new Tomorrowland stage. What would become of the remaining Tomorrowland space was up to one sponsor, Monsanto. 2 out of 3 of Monsanto's attractions were located in the South Exhibit Building, alongside the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea exhibit. The other was the Monsanto House of the Future, which sat at the entrance to the land. Given that the House of the Future was now nearly a decade old, Monsanto and Disney decided to close the attraction, but not until after the rest of the new Tomorrowland project was complete. Monsanto would also close their other 2 exhibits, the Hall of Chemistry and Fashion and Fabrics Throughout the Ages, and Disney would remove the 20,000 Leagues exhibit, freeing up the entire building for a larger Monsanto attraction, a brand new ride, utilizing a familiar concept.
A familiar concept, you say? Like ads, apparently? I need to unmute.
A concept that had been on the drawing board since the early days of Disneyland. A proposed Tomorrowland pavilion named Adventures in Science, or Science Land. This small area would have featured multiple new attractions, one of which was named Micro World. Micro World would have sent guests through a microscope, shrinking them down and allowing them to explore the inside of a drop of water. The attraction was given the nickname the Protozoa Ride among the Imagineers because of the protozoa-shaped vehicles in the initial 1957 concept art. Disney pitched the concept to Dr. Thomas and Monsanto, who liked the idea with one major note. Thomas wanted the molecule through which guests traveled to be a man-made polymer that Monsanto produced rather than a drop of water. The Imagineers pushed back on this idea. Water made much more sense, as it is one of the molecules most important to life and universally recognized among audiences. Thomas and Monsanto dropped the issue, and guests would end up traveling through water as opposed to a Monsanto creation. This would ultimately be the right decision, as the public's opinion on man-made chemicals was about to take a turn for the worse. Imagineers fleshed out the original Micro World concept. The new ride would still star water, but in a more visually interesting state, a snowflake. The ride vehicles would also no longer resemble protozoa. Instead, an entirely new ride system would be developed, thanks again to the 1964 New York World's Fair. The fair featured numerous attractions with unique ride systems, such as GM's Futurama, which featured a unique conveyor system that allowed guests to ride through visions of the future. Another ride, sponsored by Bell System, featured an even more unique continuous system. Not only was this ride system efficient, but it allowed for dark rides to tell stories in new ways. Most dark rides up to this point placed guests in a vehicle with their view unrestricted, taking them along a curved rail, although always facing in the direction the vehicle was moving. However,
Actually,
the Bell System
electrolytes are
Pavilion had
essential
guests
to
facing
life.
perpendicular to the direction in which they were traveling. These and other unique rides populated the fair and impressed crowds, including Dr. Thomas and his associates, who pressed Walt for an attraction that utilized moving vehicles, or at the very least, a moving sidewalk. Walt and his Imagineers had also been impressed with the unique ride systems of the fair, having contributed two themselves. Challenged with bringing a unique ride system to the Monsanto attraction, Imagineers considered multiple concepts, and it was at a meeting between two Imagineers that a novel idea was introduced. Imagineer Bob Gurr, who had created Disneyland's Autopia cars and contributed to the attractions for the 1964 fair, was in a brainstorming meeting with Imagineer John Hench, who had helped design the original Tomorrowland at Disneyland. Hench wondered if it was possible to place guests on a vehicle capable of rotating as it moved along the ride track, allowing guests to see in any direction or forcing them to focus only on certain parts of the ride. Gurr casually grabbed a toy from Hench's desk that resembled a candied apple. Gurr then turned the apple using his fingers, gripping the stick, asking Hench, quote, "Like this?" Hench responded, quote, "Yeah, like that." Gurr and Hench passed the concept along to Imagineers Roger E. Brogy and Burt Brundage, who got to work designing the ride system, which Gurr would dub the Omnimover. The Omnimover vehicles that would be used for the new Monsanto attraction would be referred to as the Atom Mobiles, and they would feature a large blue shell that would surround guests. Each shell would include a speaker that would place the ride's audio directly into the ears of riders. Most importantly, the shell prevented guests from viewing peripherally, forcing their sightlines so that they would only see what the Imagineers wanted them to. The Omnimover would be able to move 3,000 guests per hour throughout the attraction. Walt asked the team to make the system as smooth as possible, specifically so smooth that a martini glass could ride it without spilling. But in the end, each turn of the vehicle would be quite jerky. The ride system would not be the only innovative aspect of the Monsanto attraction. Another proposal from the original Micro World concept would be utilized. Imagineer Exitencio, who would write the script for Pirates of the Caribbean, had an idea for, quote, "a visual effect that will give the patrons the sensation of being reduced to the size of the atom." Atencio pitched the idea to Imagineer Herb Ryman, who illustrated the concept. Ryman and Atencio's initial concept showed a brass microscope with portholes, giving the illusion of guests getting progressively smaller. Some thought the design could be improved. The most recent hire at Wet Enterprises was George McGinnis, an artist that was hired straight out of college after Walt, Hench, and Gurr had viewed his student project. One day, McGinnis was eating lunch in the Wed cafeteria, sketching concepts of his own for the attraction's giant microscope on a napkin. Atencio looked over McGinnis' shoulder to see what he was working on. Liking what he saw, Atencio immediately took the napkin to the model shop to mock up the microscope. The mighty microscope, originally the magic microscope, would be the icon of the new Monsanto attraction, which was soon given the name Adventure Through Inner Space. Atencio was to write the script. Claude Coates, an Imagineer that had done extensive work on Disneyland and the World's Fair attractions, was set to design it. and Yale Gracie, a special effects artist that had worked on the Carousel of Progress, would contribute illusions to the new ride. In August of 1966, Walt suggested placing a ceramic mural on Interspace's otherwise plain exterior. He pitched the idea to Thomas, who loved the concept. Walt assigned artist Mary Blair to the mural. Blair would end up creating two separate pieces, one for the Circle Vision show building and another on Interspace's show building. The murals would be named The Spirit of Creative Energies Among Children.
Okay.
Disneyland's Tomorrowland closed in September of 1966 for the renovation. Demolition of the old attractions began through Interspace as many times as they wanted. Adventure through Interspace's queue and pre-show was one of the most elaborate created at the time. As guests entered the queue, they immediately saw McGinnis's mighty microscope. The microscope was a striking icon and, for many children, a convincing illusion, appearing to shrink the ride vehicles and guests right before their eyes. The microscope was aimed at a large petri dish. Inside, snowflakes danced, backlit by an illuminated pH scale. To the right of the microscope, a large rainbow target displayed the guest destination, the center of a snowflake. Pre-show narration, some of which was voiced by Atencio, depicted scientists making final preparations to send guests on their daring journey.
Phase blue. Light wavelength approximately 0.5000 millimeters. Definition excellent.
Phase green. Resolving power decreasing.
Plaques lined the queue, spelling out the entire adventure to guests before they even boarded. As guests reached the end of the queue, they were greeted by cast members, dressed in costumes made of polyester, a material that Monsanto manufactured. Guests boarded a moving platform and took a seat in their Atomobiles to begin their adventure through inner space. The attraction began with guests entering the mighty microscope, shrinking in size just as they had seen previous guests do. In reality, the Atomobiles simply turned to the left. Through the ride's
just as I
narration,
suspected.
Freeze played the voice of the first scientist to journey to inner space. At the beginning, this scientist could be heard calibrating the microscope to send guests into the snowflake.
Now your adventure through inner space has begun. Through the mighty microscope, you will travel into the incredible universe found within a tiny fragment of a snowflake.
During the rest of the ride, guests are only able to hear the suspended thought waves of the scientist preserved from his first journey.
I am the first person to make this fabulous journey. Suspended in the timelessness of inner space are the thought waves of my first impressions. They will be our only source of contact once you have passed beyond the limits of normal magnification.
As Freeze told guests of their journey, snowflakes, of significant size, danced around them, in effect achieved through projection. The vehicles continued to move, now rotating guests to face a large snowflake structure, confirming that they had now shrunk to the size of a snowflake. These enormous structures were enhanced through projections as well. But the journey was far from over. Guests continued to shrink, passing by walls of ice and entering a gorgeous scene of porous crystals. Atencio was a genius rider, and many of the lines delivered by Freeze are beautiful and haunting.
And still I continue to shrink. What compelling force draws me into this mysterious darkness?
Guests then shrank smaller and broke into inner space. Riders viewed molecules floating around them, represented by wire balls on string. Mirrors on the walls gave the illusion that there were many more molecules than there actually were. Guests then learned that they had shrunk even further, as they could now see H2O molecules almost as big as they were. Dancing electrons could also be viewed. The journey continued, as guests entered the oxygen atom, with light swirling to show that the electrons now surrounded the guests.
Electrons are dashing about me like so many fiery comets. Can I possibly survive?
Then the ride reached its climax, pushing guests straight toward the nucleus of the atom. The nucleus of the atom was represented by a flashing red light bulb. The narrator considers shrinking even smaller to explore it.
Do I dare explore the vastness of its inner space? No, I dare not go on. I must return to the realm of the molecule before I go on shrinking forever.
Guests then began their journey back, growing from the size of an atom to the size of a molecule. Projections reveal that the snowflake is melting.
Yes, the snowflake has melted, but there is no cause for alarm. You are back on visual and returning to your normal size.
As guests continued to grow in size, a large human eye peering at them through the other end of the microscope could be seen above their heads. After turning a final corner and returning back to their normal size, guests exited the microscope, disembarking from their vehicles, but not before passing a brilliant rain illusion called the Fountain of Fashion, showing off Monsanto products. As guests exited their automobiles, they entered a post-show dedicated to select Monsanto creations, depicted by elaborate and impressive animated posters and product displays. The carpets at the exit to inner space were made from Monsanto acrylion fibers and Cumuloft fibers. The post-show area also featured a unique global clock that displayed the time anywhere in the world, similar to the former entranceway icon of Tomorrowland. But this clock also showed all of Monsanto's facilities worldwide. Guests riding the People Mover, which passed through the show building, were given a unique perspective of the attraction's pre-show and post-show, as well as an exclusive view of a second-story mural. Guests flocked to the attraction, including some celebrities.
One of the early travelers through inner space was Prince Rainier of Monaco and his attractive children.
The ride thrilled audiences, but it also
Monaco?
terrified them. Those young enough to buy into the illusion in the pre-show actually believed they were being shrunk down, unsure if they would ever grow back to their normal size. However, even kids and adults that knew the experience was fiction couldn't help but get chills from the pitch-black darkness and the echoing voice of Paul Frees. Teenagers were the least affected by the ride's atmosphere, but this did not keep them away. A few rowdy teenagers made it a challenge to grab and steal the hanging props throughout the ride, taking them home as souvenirs. Others made a game of trying to spit at the eye projection at the ride's end. This prompted Disneyland to be more strict in their envelope of protection, which exists to prevent guests from being able to reach and touch objects along a ride track. This also led to more CCTV cameras installed on rides to monitor guest behavior. But as much as teens took from the ride, they would also add to the ride's narrative with chemicals of their own, hormones. Adventure through inner space became a favorite among teen park goers, hoping for some private time at the park. Not only was the ride dark, but the OmniMover ride system provided unique privacy, as guests were never facing one another, and even during the brief times in which they were adjacent, The large shell blocked much of the view. Adventure Through Inner Space would be added to the park's ticket system in 1972, designated as a C ticket. Rumors say that this is due to teens taking advantage of the free attraction, so requiring a ticket on the ride would discourage this behavior, or at the very least, Disney would profit from it. However, this did not work, and Disneyland operators reportedly sped up the attraction in order to shorten it, which seems more like a challenge than a solution. This strategy messed with the ride's effects and the pitch of the narration. At the time of Inner Space's debut in 1966, Monsanto was the 33rd largest company in America. Even more interesting is that they were only the 3rd largest chemical company in America. Monsanto was primarily focused on agriculture, but they had recently found success with ChemStrand, a subsidiary that was the largest manufacturer of synthetic fiber at the time. This venture meant that Monsanto not only created herbicides and pesticides for farming and the opposite of farming, but they also had a strong presence in the consumer product space, producing everything from carpets to rugs to clothes, as can be seen throughout Adventure Through Inner Space's post-show. This is one of the reasons that the company's relationship with Disney was so attractive, as Disneyland would end up being the company's primary way of presenting themselves to consumers and demystifying their work in the chemical field, convincing customers that Monsanto was not creating anything to be afraid of, just a few years before it was revealed that they were responsible for creating something that people should absolutely be afraid of.
Oh.
1968, the year after Adventure Through Inner Space opened, was a tumultuous year in the United States. From the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. to the assassination of Robert Kennedy, to the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, to the election of Richard Nixon, America was fractured and chaotic. At the forefront of Americans' minds was the Vietnam War, which was at its peak. Over 500,000 U.S. troops were now in Vietnam, and the Tet Offensive, launched by the North, was reducing any hopes America had of winning the conflict. The given reason for America's involvement in the conflict was to spread democracy and stop the growth of communism. But this was becoming less convincing and accepted as more about the war was revealed. Anti-war protests broke out across the country, leading to a thriving counterculture movement that sought to bring peace to the world and tear down many existing social norms and restrictions. Not even Disneyland was exempt from the conflict. On August 6, 1970, around 300 members of the Youth International Party, or Yippies as they were popularly known, invaded Disneyland to protest the war. While an increasing number of Americans began to speak out against Vietnam, the conflict continued. Ground troops were constantly being outmaneuvered by the North, who were able to hide soldiers in Vietnam's dense forests. To combat this, the US initiated Operation Ranch Hand, in which US planes began spraying defoliants and herbicides over the forests of South Vietnam, in an attempt to remove the lucrative foliage cover and damage the food supply of the North. By 1968, this was a primary tactic utilized by the US Air Force, who used many different chemical agents, each named after the colored marking on their drums, such as Agent Blue, Agent White, and the most commonly used, Agent Orange. The main manufacturer of the chemicals, and the manufacturer who produced the most toxic of the formulas, was none other than the Monsanto Chemical Company.
Miracles from molecules around us everywhere. There are miracles from molecules in the earth, the sea, the air. Now men with dreams are furthering what nature first began, making modern miracles from molecules for man. Making modern miracles.
Using that song in this context,
for man.
Tragically, the true effects of Agent Orange were not immediately realized, and Monsanto was rarely the target of counterculture protests in this period, with that honor going to the Dow Chemical Company, who also produced Agent Orange, but were targeted by protesters for producing the flammable gel napalm, which was also being used in Vietnam. This extended Monsanto's life in consumer products, and the company continued to turn to Disney as their major outlet of reaching the public. Also in 1968, Monsanto president and CEO Edward J. Bach announced that the chemical company would be one of the primary corporate partners of Walt Disney World's construction in Orlando, Florida. Operation Ranch Hand continued until 1971, when a government study linking the herbicides to birth defects was leaked to the press. After this, President Richard Nixon ended the program. Throughout the early 1970s, more reports began to emerge on the damage of the herbicides. With Monsanto's involvement revealed, reports would worsen each year, and by the mid-1970s, as the US pulled its last troops out of Vietnam, the true effects of the herbicide could finally be seen. From 1961 to 1971, the US sprayed over 19 million gallons of defoliants in Vietnam. Agent Orange, which contained dioxins, a highly toxic class of carcinogens, resulted in unquantifiable suffering on the environment, Vietnamese people, and US troops. It is estimated that 400,000 people were either killed or critically injured as a result of the herbicidal warfare. As Monsanto made headlines for their involvement with the herbicides, Adventure Through Inner Space continued to entertain guests at Disneyland. At some point, the pre-show target effect was refurbished, with a sign explaining that the piece represents miniaturization control. The Fountain of Fashion would change to simply display rotating Monsanto signs. The post-show would eventually lose the world clock, and more product displays took its place. These were eventually removed, when the entire back wall was removed and traffic was redirected through the neighboring character shop, resulting in one of the first theme park gift shop exits. In 1977, Monsanto's 10-year contract for Adventure Through Inner Space was up for renewal. Despite the company's long-held relationship with Disney, the company declined to renew their sponsorship. Disney was certainly better off distancing themselves from Monsanto, whose public image was falling rapidly and would continue to decline. The same year that Monsanto declined to renew their Disneyland sponsorship, the company funneled millions of dollars into a new campaign aimed at convincing consumers that Monsanto's chemical products were good for them, despite the fact that they were alleged carcinogens. Monsanto was removed from the ride's narration, and their logos were removed throughout the attraction. The post-show was heavily altered, with the water effect being turned off, and the animated Monsanto posters replaced with attraction posters. The year after Monsanto declined to renew its sponsorship, the first of a series of class action lawsuits were filed by US veterans, attempting to hold Monsanto and other manufacturers responsible for the toxic and carcinogenic herbicides. 4 years after this, Dr. Charles Allen Thomas would pass away. His obituary lamented the public's newfound perception of big business as evil. This perception had worsened significantly throughout his lifetime. Many factors contributed to this decrease in institutional trust, but few, if any, are as significant as the Vietnam War, which fundamentally changed the way Americans thought and perceived themselves. Not only was trust in institutions down, but the post-war patriotism of the 1950s, that had in part led to the success of Disneyland, was more or less gone. A once optimistic America was suddenly cynical. Corporations that had once branded themselves as the shepherds of the future and had taken up residency in Disneyland's Tomorrowland were now in full damage control. And this was just the beginning. Despite the lack of sponsor, Adventure Through Inner Space continued to entertain throughout the 1980s, but its age was certainly showing. The snowflake effect in the queue was now broken. Many of the effects throughout the ride itself were either turned off or barely visible, and fewer guests were taking the voyage through inner space. Some complained that the cars were too cramped and that the speaker was too loud against their ear. Tony Baxter, an Imagineer who had risen the ranks to become the first prominent creative mind in the company's second generation of theme park designers, admitted to the press that Adventure Through Inner Space needed to be revised or eliminated, explaining that audiences don't respond to light shows and that the ride contained scientific inaccuracies. However, the company had no refurbishment or replacement plans in mind. That was until 1984, when newly appointed CEO Michael Eisner reached a deal with filmmaker George Lucas to create a new Star Wars-based attraction for Disneyland. While Imagineers were initially hesitant to place the fantasy attraction in the science-based land, they eventually agreed to a simulator concept named Star Tours, which was set to open in 1986. It was determined that the best location for Star Tours would be Inner Space's show building, meaning that after 18 years of operation, Adventure Through Inner Space would shrink its last guest. The final day of operation would be on September 2nd, 1985. Most of the ride was destroyed, the mighty microscope was torn apart, and all but a few Atomobiles were sent to a landfill in Mexico. Its closure would be a quiet one, but its legacy on Disneyland and the theme park industry was significant. One of Adventure Through Inner Space's biggest impacts on Disney parks would be its Omnimover ride system, a technology that would be used again for multiple attractions, most famously as the Doom Buggies in the Haunted Mansion. Adventure Through Inner Space was also Disney's first edutainment dark ride, and their most educational attraction at the time. Tributes to Inner Space could also be found in its successor. The ride's pre-show layout was retained for Star Tours, with the mighty microscope being replaced with a Starspeeder 3000 in the queue. This layout was retained when Star Tours was cloned for multiple other Disney parks throughout the world. The original Star Tours did not make use of Inner Space's post-show, and it became a storage area for the neighboring gift shop. This was until 1998, when it was replaced by extended queue space for Star Tours. One of the small Atomobiles from the Mighty Microscope could be found for a short time in the overhead conveyor system, and the Mighty Microscope could be spotted in Star Tours ride film. This Easter egg carried over into Star Tours' successor, Star Tours: The Adventures Continue, which also added another reference to inner space in a luggage scan gag in the queue. In 1998, a new Tomorrowland mural made reference to inner space, and that same year, the exhibit Innoventions opened with a parody of inner space in its phone booth.
Yes, your phone time is up, but there is no cause for alarm. You can deposit more.
These are just a few of the many references Disney has made to the defunct ride throughout the years. Adventure Through Inner Space was immediate proof that the Imagineers could create something spectacular even in the absence of their former leader. Whether it was Yale Gracie's illusions, Claude Coast's production design, or Atencio's writing, Walt had left his park and WED Enterprises in great hands. However, Adventure Through Inner Space, as well as other attractions already in progress at the time of Walt's death, were mere trial runs for the challenge that was awaiting the Imagineers, as Walt had left them with more than just his philosophies and a few unfinished rides. He had left them with 27,000 acres of swampland in Florida and a dream called Epcot. And this is where Adventure Through Inner Space's true legacy would be seen. As the Imagineers continued developing the Florida project, opening the resort with the Magic Kingdom theme park in 1971, they were still deciding what to do with Walt's Epcot. It was eventually decided that instead of a city, WED would build a second theme park for the Florida resort, filled with edutainment attractions sponsored by major corporations. A permanent World's Fair dedicated to the idea of the future and optimism, to debut to a post-Vietnam, cynical America. This would be the Imagineers' greatest challenge yet. This was Epcot Center.
Damn. I wasn't expecting this video to take that turn. It was like, oh, new ride sponsored by Monsanto? And then all of a sudden, the war, Agent Orange, and it's like, oh, okay. I was like, I'm not sure if anyone saw that coming. Alright, one last video. Nothing too long, though. Nara Dreamland just did that. Nickelodeon Hotel? Maybe. Fantastic World of Hanna-Barbera. Barbera? Oh yeah, Action Park. Back to the Future, the ride. Oh, snap. Wait, is this his very first video? I think I've scrolled all the way to the bottom. Jaws the ride. Okay, okay. That got my attention. You get no ad time here.
Salutations, my name is Kevin Perjurer, and welcome to another edition in Defunctland. For background/context on this series, please visit thepurge.com with the link below. Today we will be attempting to resurrect our first non-Disney attraction, Jaws the Ride, that operated in Universal Studios Florida from 1990 to 2012. This is also our first viewer-suggested addition to the park, so thank you to Cinematic Psycho Productions for the comment. To all of you Disney fanatics that don't care about Universal Studios, stick with me, because there will be plenty of Disney history weaved throughout this story.
Obligatory Eisner reference.
In the mid-1960s, Universal, who at the time was owned by multimedia company MCA, completely refurbished the Universal Studios tour, creating the beginning of Universal Studios Hollywood as we know it today.
This put them in direct competition with other LA-based amusement park, Disneyland. As Universal Studios Hollywood continued to add additions to their park, including a Jaws encounter during the studio tour, MCA kept a close eye on Disney. When word got around that Disney was planning on operating a new theme park in Florida, MCA followed closely behind, with a new studio tour in Orlando in an attempt to attract some of the tourists that would be traveling to Walt Disney World. This began the ongoing feud between Universal Studios and Disney. I won't dive fully into the feud as I would be touching on the history of future Defunctland attractions, but just to give you an idea, yeah, they're basically the same thing. So Disney MGM Studios began construction in 1985, obviously angering Universal as Disney had copied many aspects of their plan and already existing park. However, luckily for Universal and MCA, they had recently found a developer for their Orlando park. They had also found a creative partner, Steven Spielberg. That's right. If you've watched the first episode of Defunctland, you'll remember that George Lucas was heavily involved in the development of attractions for Disney at this time. And if you don't already know, George Lucas and Steven Spielberg are very close friends, who found themselves in competition with one another in the late 1980s due to this feud. Universal decided not to make their Orlando park the same as their Hollywood tram tour out of fear of being accused of copying Disney. They decided to instead focus more on film-based attractions, such as Confrontation and Jaws the Ride.
Went on some sort of Jaws ride in the mid-2000s. I don't think I've been on any Jaws-based ride before.
The creative head of Universal Studios Florida was former Disney Imagineer and Steven Spielberg's college roommate, Peter Alexander. Universal had no experience creating epic attractions like Disney's, so the management was worried about the concept of the Florida park. Alexander spearheaded the ride, and Ride and Show Engineering agreed to produce it. The first version of the ride cost $30 million to make in the late 1980s, which, factoring in inflation, yeah, it was expensive, and the results were interesting. The original Jaws ride took guests on a pontoon boat captained by an employee who would guide the boat on a tour of Amity, the town in Jaws. Then shockingly, the guests spot a
shark! 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 Shark!
The shark would then stalk you for the rest of the ride, even appearing in the boathouse that you're hiding out in. In the first version of the ride, at one point, the robot shark would actually take a bite out of the boat and attempt to spin it. This would have been amazing, except for it almost never worked correctly. Like the robot made for the movie Jaws, the Jaws ride sharks experienced a variety of problems. First, sometimes the robot shark would not lunge out of the water to grab the boat. Second, if it did, the robot's shark teeth would sometimes damage the boat because for some reason they used real shark teeth. In the finale of the original ride, the skipper would shoot the shark with a grenade launcher. It would then explode and chunks of shark would fly out of the water. They would fly out of a small air cannon and then would be filtered back in and recirculated. The sharks were guided by computers and could swim at 20 feet per second. It was an impressive ride, but did it work as they had planned? No. The answer is no.
Nothing ever works as planned.
As we stroll through the streets of Amity, this little New England village seems like any seaside resort in summer. Young men thronging around the shooting gallery, people basking in the sun, crowds taking photographs of a great white shark. A great white shark. But this is a movie set, and this is where Jaws turns an elemental fear of the water into screaming terror. But today the sea is calm. It's a good day for a boat ride.
Disney MGM Studios opened on May 1st, 1989, and a year later, Universal Studios Florida opened on June 7th, 1990. Opening day was a star-studded event. Celebrities such as Sylvester Stallone, Steven Spielberg, and Bill Cosby were in attendance. The opening was a huge success for people that like to watch everything go wrong.
I hope this cuts. This is a lot thicker than what we rehearsed with.
The power went out just hours before the opening, many of the attraction's automation systems weren't operating, and Jaws had to shut down due to a thunderstorm after a few hours of operation. Steven Spielberg was rumored to be stuck on the ride during this time. The following few days of opening did not go much better. Jaws was still not operating correctly. One skipper was quoted as saying, "Imagine explosions over there." These problems would continue with the ride. At times, Universal would inform guests in the morning that Jaws would not be open that day, regardless of whether it was or not. Universal tried to stay positive about the ride, but it became apparent that it wasn't operating properly. On top of this, they would be faced with a lawsuit as during one voyage, a guest fell off the boat and into the water with Jaws. He was on a family trip with his children that were obviously mortified that their father would be eaten. Worse, he fell in one of the 10 feet deep areas where the sharks are held. The other areas of the ride were only 4 feet deep. If you haven't figured it out already, this means that he was incredibly close to the mechanics of the ride. He even recalled that the shark was swimming right toward him. When the employees managed to get him back on the boat, the other guests clapped, thinking it was all just part of the show. He sued Universal for $1 million.
Oh my god.
This, along with the fact that the ride shut down almost daily, helped Universal come to the conclusion that it was time to drastically change the ride. The original version of Jaws closed after only 2.5 months of operation.
They thought it was part of the ride.
It is safe to say that Universal and MCA were mad. They sued Ride and Show Engineering for not designing the ride properly. Ride and Show claimed that their handiwork was not at fault, and that Universal did not give them enough time. Ride and Show even said that they were looking forward to the case, so that they could prove that Universal messed up and not them. They later settled out of court, with Ride and Show commenting, "Basically, Universal didn't have any experience with a ride like this. If we had built something like this for Disneyland, Disneyland maintenance would have taken it over and made it work." Oh no, they didn't. Universal was now determined to get Jaws operating correctly as soon as possible, and after more delays and more problems, they finally settled on a 1993 opening date. They hired Totally Fun Company to redesign the ride, a company started by Peter Alexander. They also hired a variety of contractors to complete the many different aspects of the attraction to ensure that it was done correctly the second time around. The new story incorporated elements from both Jaws and Jaws 2. In the new ride, the
Shark! 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 Shark!
would not bite the boat or be blown to pieces, but there would instead be a gas explosion, and the shark would be killed after it bit a high voltage wire, such as in the end of Jaws 2. This was Peter Alexander's final suggestion before he left the project to go to the other end of the park and produce shows for Nickelodeon Studios. The fire scene would have to be impressive, and the pyrotechnics testing it purposefully designed it so that the guests could feel the heat without getting burned. They definitely accomplished this, as guests regularly complained that they had been burned by the fire, mostly by those that had already had sunburns from a day at the park. The main issue with the original attraction was that the water made it difficult for the robot sharks to go from a complete standstill to lunging out of the water. Universal decided to hire Oceaneer International, a company specializing in products that assist in deep-sea exploration, to build the sharks. They were able to accomplish this, although the detail on the sharks does not match that of the original attraction. But who cares about details if you can't see them because the ride is always closed? An interesting aspect of the remodeling was the testing phase, because in order to view changes made to the attraction, the technicians would have to take a round trip on the boat as they could not go in reverse. This means that they were taking trip after trip through the ride to witness minor changes. With all of these contractors on board and $40 million later, Universal was able to complete the second version of the attraction for a soft opening in 1993, using the term technical rehearsals until 1994.
Technical rehearsals.
We're definitely in hot water now.
Oh my god.
No survivors. And you thought this only happened in the movies. That's what I thought. So catch Jaws at Universal Studios. One ride and you're hooked.
So the final version of the attraction went like this. As you waited in line, you were taken through the boathouses of Amity, including TV screens playing WJWS 13. It had a lot of different programming with numerous references to the film and other movies as well. Once you were done waiting in line, you board one of Captain Jake's boats with the skipper to tour the island of Amity. You take off with your tour guide explaining the shark attacks of 1974 that were later turned into a hit movie. They also point out the houses of some of the characters of the Jaws movies, until suddenly they get a call of distress from Amity 3. The skipper tries to see what is going on and finds Amity 3 sinking. Then the guests see
Shark! 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 Shark!
The skipper pulls out the grenade launcher, not realizing that it is actually loaded at first, and fires at the monster, missing. The skipper misses a second time before hiding in a boathouse to wait for Chief Brody. The shark tries to break in, and the skipper struggles to escape, but does just in time. Chief Brody tells the skipper that he'll be there in 10 minutes. The skipper replies with the now famous line, "We'll be shark bait in 10 minutes," which doesn't actually make sense since technically they are already shark bait. Anyways, the shark comes back and the skipper misses with the grenade launcher once again, this time accidentally igniting a nearby gas dock. The skipper then explains that they are going to unload the guests onto a fishing dock in an attempt to save them. However, the shark appears once again, but this time it accidentally bites down on a high voltage power cable, frying it. The guests smell the roasted shark and it makes one final lunge for the boat, but the skipper is able to kill it with the grenade launcher. Everyone cheers as they are returned safely to Amity. All in all, the shark appears 5 times on the starboard side and only twice on the port side, so you were luckier to be placed on the starboard side. So that was Jaws the ride, but hold on because its history is not over just yet. A few notable events took place with the ride after its second release. First, every year the attraction was drained, and the Department of Environmental Protection was tipped that oil and other toxins from the ride were being irresponsibly disposed of, which essentially just meant that they had to change their fuel type and do a lot of paperwork. In 2004, hurricanes caused gas prices to increase in Florida to the point that it was too expensive to operate the Jaws ride, thus causing it to be open only infrequently and seasonally from 2005
too expensive
to 2007.
to operate.
Also, the attraction was refurbished constantly to ensure that the ride operated correctly. So why was it closed? Unlike other Defunctland entries, this one is pretty simple. Harry Potter. The franchise was going to and did save Universal's attendance numbers, and Jaws was replaced with the Diagon Alley attraction, Harry Potter and the Escape from Gringotts. While the attraction at Universal is gone, there is still a Jaws operating at Universal Studios Japan, and the short scene during the tram tour is still operating in Hollywood. So that is the history of Jaws the ride. There are a few more interesting anecdotes to the attraction that I decided weren't relevant enough to discuss here, but if you would like to read more on Jaws, visit the links below. One is to themeparktourist.com, which is where I got the majority of my research for extraterrestrial and Jaws, and the other is to a Reddit AMA by a skipper who worked on the ride. I recommend checking both of these out. As always, to learn more about where the remains of Jaws are today, how I'm going to get them back, and where I will place them in Defunctland, please visit thepurge.com with the link below. Otherwise, thank you for watching, and don't forget to comment, share, and subscribe.
Never seen Jaws or spin-off of it? Wait, you've never seen Jaws? Surprising. I feel like everyone has seen Jaws at some point. I think my parents have it on DVD, the first Jaws at any rate. I need to look up the plot of, like, Jaws 2. Like, what did they do this time around? But yeah, gonna call it here for today. Thank you, everyone, for stopping by. Hope y'all had fun. I know I did. But yeah, thanks for being here. Thank you to anyone watching the VOD. Oh, got someone I can raid? Alright. Do tell, do tell. And what are they doing? Oh, I see. I could... I just gotta sit through this ad real quick. Alright, let me get that raid ready. Alright then. But yeah, thank you once again for stopping by. Remember to hydrate, rest up, eat tasty things, all that good jazz, and peace!